Chapter 1, Section 1, the very first piece of our brand new book about bacteria to plants is all about life. What is life? There are two objectives that go along with this section. The first is to list the characteristics all living things share, and the second is to identify what all living things need to survive. Here we are right away on our second slide talking about that first objective. What are some characteristics that all living things share? Before we jump into the list, just a quick note. Sometimes instead of hearing me say living things, you might hear me say the word organism instead. Organism is just another word for a living thing. So all living things, or all organisms, have 6 characteristics in common. They're all made up of cells. They have cellular organization. They contain similar chemicals, so you'll find water, for instance, inside every living thing. Same with proteins, same with some carbohydrates, and so on and so on. They all use energy, and they use that energy specifically, among other reasons, to help them grow and to develop. They all respond to their surroundings in some way, shape, or form, and lastly, all living things are able to reproduce. So what do we mean when we say, let's start with the first thing on our list. What do we mean when we say cellular organization? We mean that all living things are made up of one or more cells. And the cell is the basic unit of structure and function in an organism. So basically what that's saying in slightly less scientific terms is that cells are the simplest building blocks inside of a living thing, and living things are oftentimes made up of lots and lots of these cells all working together. Cells tend to be very small, even though there are some organisms, some living things, that are only made up of one cell total. We call these one-celled organisms unicellular organisms, or unicellular living things. It just means that the whole animal, or that whole living thing, is just one cell big. Most of the time, however, animals or organisms are multicellular. A multicellular organism is made up of multiple cells. This is where things really get interesting because the cells inside multicellular organisms tend to be specialized. They tend to be specially created to do different tasks. For instance, a nerve cell, like this nerve cell you see in the lower left-hand corner of the picture on the screen, are designed to carry messages from the brain and to the body and back to the brain again. Nerve cells allow us to sense and respond to our surroundings. Muscle cells, like this picture in the upper right-hand corner of the image, have 2 jobs. They either contract, they get smaller, or they relax and they get longer. And those 2 movements, contraction and relaxation, allow the muscle cells to move all the parts and pieces of our body. It's pretty simple, right? Contract, relax, but that allows us to do even the most complex motions or actions with our body, like performing surgery or deactivating a bomb. Blood cells, like the white blood cell that you see here on the upper left-hand corner of our image, are responsible for a variety of things. White blood cells help to fight infections. Red blood cells help to carry oxygen to all of the other tissues and cells in the body. And then there are plenty of unicellular organisms out there as well. This picture in the lower right-hand corner of the screen or of the image is a unicellular bacteria. So that's the entire living thing right there, the entire organism in that box. Like we said on the second slide, all cells are composed of similar chemicals. Water is the most abundant chemical that we're going to find inside of cells. It's also the simplest molecule. You'll notice it's right here. There is one hydrogen atom, and there are 2 oxygen atoms, H2O. That's all that water is. It's pretty simple. Carbohydrates, like this glucose molecule here, are a cell's energy source, and you'll notice that they're a bit more complex. Carbohydrates tend to be things like sugars, so they're really great for energy. Proteins and lipids are more complex still, and they are building materials inside of a cell. This is a 3D rendering of a protein, and you notice all of these little spheres are similar molecules to glucose, and there are thousands of them in a single protein. Because these guys are more complex, they can link together and they can give commands to other cells in different ways. Lipids are fats. A lipid is another word for a fat, and we know very well, probably by this point in quarantine, that if you eat a little bit too much food, those lipids are really great for building and combining together, and they form nice little fatty layers inside of our bodies. And the nucleic acids, this last picture here, are additional instructions. These are the instructions that make up the DNA inside of our cells. So they are most directly in charge of telling the different parts of a cell what to do, directing cells' activities. All living things use energy. They use it not just to grow, but also to repair one another. We are always damaging our bodies in big ways and small, on accident, and sometimes sadly on purpose too. And so our bodies use energy to repair all of those injuries. Also, remember, individual cells have specific jobs, like our muscle cells contract and relax, and our nerve cells transmit nerve impulses. All of those jobs are accomplished through energy. Living things grow and develop. Now, growth is not new to us, and we see non-living things growing too. Think about a stalactite or a stalagmite in a cave. Over lots and lots of years, that stalactite or stalagmite is growing, right? It's becoming larger. What it's not doing, however, is developing. Development is the process that occurs when an organism becomes more complex. So we see in the picture on the screen that this baby has become more complex. Right now, it's taller, it's able to walk, it's able to do all sorts of fine motor things it couldn't before, it's able to reproduce. And so that process of development, of changing to become more complex, is unique to living things. Non-living things can grow, but they can't develop in the sense that they can't become more complex. And last but not least, or second to last, we have that living things can respond to their surroundings. All living things react to changes in their environment. And these changes that cause an organism to react are called stimuli, or a stimulus if we're talking singular. Stimuli may include all sorts of things: changes in temperature, changes in light, changes in sound. In the case of this picture of the frog in the Venus flytrap on the screen, this is actually a change in pressure. The frog is stepping on a pressure sensor inside the Venus flytrap that causes the response, which is the Venus flytrap, to close. The response in this picture up here is that the light is causing the response, the flower, to bend towards it so that it can pick up more sunlight, more energy through its leaves for that process called photosynthesis. Non-living things do not respond or react to stimuli in the environment the same way that living things do. Now for the last characteristic of living things. All living things are able to reproduce. That means that they're able to create offspring that are similar to the parents. A dog is always going to produce offspring that are dogs, and a bacteria is always going to produce offspring that are bacteria. This is a really important thing to understand. All offspring will look like their parents. Now, I don't mean look as in like they're always going to have the same color eyes and the same color hair. I'm talking big picture characteristics, like the same number of limbs, the same organs, the same abilities to respond to surroundings, all of that sort of stuff. For a long time, scientists had a lot of misconceptions, a lot of inaccurate thoughts about life. One of the biggest ones was this idea of spontaneous generation. It's just a fancy way to say that scientists for the longest time thought that living things, instead of coming from other living things, they thought they came from non-living sources, sort of like magic, like poof, and here's this living thing. It took hundreds of years to convince people that this idea of spontaneous generation, living things coming from non-living things, is very, very wrong. The very first person to start convincing people that this is not how things work was an Italian scientist named Francesco Redi. He designed a controlled experiment in the mid-1600s that helped people to understand that fruit flies, or flies in general, did not come from decaying meat. People thought, they thought that that flies arose spontaneously, randomly out of meat. That was where they came from. And so if you got rid of meat, you got rid of flies. Not exactly the case, right? And Francesco Redi's controlled experiment helped to prove that. A controlled experiment is an experiment where the scientist is going to do two tests that are identical to one another in every way except for one factor. That factor that is going to change, and actually the factors that stay the same too, all factors in an experiment are called variables. So the controlled experiment has tons of variables that are being kept the same, and one variable only that is going to be able to change. While Francesco Redi's experiment, his controlled experiment, was very good. It didn't quite convince everybody. So it took another 200 years and another scientist, this time a French chemist named Louis Pasteur, to design another controlled experiment that finally disproved this idea that living things could come from non-living things. Francesco Redi's experiment involved putting meat inside of 3 containers. The first container he left open, the second container he sealed completely, and the third container he sealed so that the flies couldn't get in or out. So he used this piece of gauze, but they could still sort of sense what was in the jar, and stuff inside the jar could sort of sense what was happening outside too, I guess, if it's living. And what he found is that the unsealed jar had lots and lots of flies around it, and the sealed jar had none. The one that was covered with gauze, where there was some idea or communication between the inside and the outside of the jar, he found that flies liked to congregate around the lid, but they couldn't get in. So he looked at the meat under a microscope to see what was different about these jars. And what he found was maggots. Maggots were growing onto the meat in the jar that was unsealed. Maggots were growing on the gauze of the jar where they could kind of sense what was inside. And there was no presence of maggots in the jar that was sealed. And so he noticed that it wasn't the meat that the flies were coming from, it was the maggots instead. Louis Pasteur designed an experiment that used chicken broth. He took chicken broth and he put it into containers that had been sealed. These are up here, have been sealed. And then he put it into containers that had not been sealed, that were exposed to the outside environment. And what he found is that if he boiled the broth that was in the sealed containers did not go bad. It didn't develop a bunch of bacteria, but the broth that had been exposed to the outside environment, even if it was boiled, started to develop bacteria. So he found that the bacteria was actually coming from the outside world. It wasn't coming from the broth itself. The last piece of our section is about needs of living things, and this was your second objective if you remember back to the very first slide. All living things need 4 basic needs met in order to survive. They need energy, water, living space, and stable internal conditions. Now, you and I oftentimes think of our basic needs as being food, water, shelter, and clothing. This is the list that we hear most often for humans. Notice that it meets, or mirrors rather, the basic needs for all living things as well. Even bacteria and plants need these same things, just in a slightly different way. All living things need energy. In our case, energy comes from food. All living things need water. Same here. All living things need a living space. Now for humans, we need a little bit extra shelter because we don't have fur or those blubber layers or other adaptations to allow us to survive as easily in the wide open spaces of the wild. We need a more confined shelter. And then stable internal conditions. Clothing helps us to do that, believe it or not. When we get really, really cold, in order to keep our bodies warm, one of the things we do is we add clothing, right? So organisms get energy in all sorts of different ways. We talked a lot in our very first book of this year about autotrophs and heterotrophs. An autotroph is an organism that makes its own food using energy from the sun as its energy source. And heterotrophs cannot make their own food, so they have to eat autotrophs or other heterotrophs. We talked about how all living things need water in order to survive. The reason that they need water is because it helps with a variety of processes inside of a living thing. It helps a living thing to obtain chemicals from its surroundings. It helps to break down food, actually to grow, to move substances within their bodies, and to reproduce. Part of the reason why water is so important is because it can dissolve. It can dissolve more chemicals than any other substance on Earth, as a matter of fact. All living things also need a space to live. Sometimes organisms have to compete for that space. If there's too many living things in a small space, it results in competition. Plants are always competing, and they're competing both above ground and below ground. Plants compete for sunlight, their leaves above ground, and then their roots below ground compete for soil and for water. Animals sometimes have to compete for space. Other times, though, think back to our first book, they're able to share living spaces and form ecosystems. And then lastly, we see the need for stable internal conditions. So the outside world is always changing, right? It changes in terms of temperature, it changes in terms of precipitation, it changes in terms of the amount of stress it's putting on us. And so it's important for our bodies to be able to maintain stable conditions on the inside, despite all those changes happening on the outside. We call this process, this amazing ability of the body to stay stable on the inside, homeostasis. And there are lots of different ways that the body helps to maintain homeostasis, to stay constant on the inside. The picture on the screen shows a person shaking, and that's actually one of the body's ways of maintaining an even temperature, a warm temperature on the inside of its body, even though it might be cold outside. When your body shakes and shivers, it's producing heat, and that heat helps to keep you warm. So this section was long. After watching the video, all I want you to do is to finish your notes. We had the first part of this section due for today. Part 2 is going to be due on Monday. Hopefully this doesn't take you too long because part 2 is shorter than part 1. When you're finished, have a great weekend. Enjoy your time off.